The bitter rivalry between Jews and Arabs didn't begin with modern politics or land disputes. It erupted from the pages of humanity's oldest stories, born in a family drama so explosive it has torn through centuries like wildfire. This isn't just ancient history. It's the original broken home that fractured the world. Imagine this scene. A desperate, aging man named Abraham, promised countless descendants by his God, yet with a barren wife and time running out. The solution: Sarah, his wife, offers her Egyptian slave Hagar as a surrogate, a decision that would ignite tensions felt to this day. When Hagar bears Ishmael, Abraham finally has his heir. But then the unthinkable happens. Sarah, well past childbearing age, miraculously conceives and delivers Isaac. Suddenly, the inheritance is contested. Two mothers, two sons, one divine promise, and a powder keg of jealousy. What follows is one of history's most consequential family banishments. Sarah, seeing Ishmael as a threat to her son's inheritance, demands Abraham cast out Hagar and Ishmael into the desert wilderness. Essentially a death sentence in ancient times. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, she insists. For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Abraham, torn between his firstborn and the son of his beloved wife, reluctantly obeys after divine reassurance that both sons will father great nations. This moment, a mother and child abandoned in the desert with nothing but a skin of water, marks the first violent rupture between what would become two mighty peoples. The texts pull no punches about what this meant. One son would inherit the covenant, the promised land, and divine favor. The other would forge his own destiny away from his father's household. This wasn't just family drama, it was divine election versus exile, chosen versus cast out, inheritance versus disinheritance. As these brothers grew into nations, their divergent paths carved deep valleys between them. The descendants of Isaac, the Israelites, would develop a theology centered on being God's uniquely chosen people with an exclusive claim to the land of Canaan. Meanwhile, through Ishmael came the Arab tribes, who would later embrace Islam, and its competing theological claim that Abraham's true spiritual heir was actually Ishmael, not Isaac. This theological combat zone intensified when Islam emerged in the 7th century CE. The Quran reframes the narrative, elevating Ishmael from his secondary biblical status to a prophet of equal standing with Isaac. More explosively, Islamic tradition holds that it was Ishmael, not Isaac, whom Abraham nearly sacrificed to God, directly challenging the Jewish understanding of their special covenant. At stake wasn't merely theological bragging rights, but the very question of who were Abraham's true spiritual heirs with legitimate claims to his legacy and lands. Each side clutched their competing narratives like weapons, with ancestors transformed into ammunition for present-day conflicts. The texts themselves contain stark contradictions. Genesis portrays Ishmael as a wild donkey of a man, whose hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, seemingly predicting endless conflict. Yet elsewhere, the Bible notes that Isaac and Ishmael reunited to bury their father Abraham, a tantalizing glimpse of reconciliation that history has largely ignored. This ancestral rivalry transcended mere symbolism, becoming the template for how these peoples would interact. When Muslim armies swept through the Middle East in the 7th century, they encountered substantial Jewish populations. Their relationship was defined by the Islamic concept of dhimmi, protected but subordinate status for people of the book. Jews could practice their religion but faced restrictions and special taxes that constantly reminded them of their inferior position in the social hierarchy. Throughout the medieval period, this relationship fluctuated dramatically. In Islamic Spain, Jews experienced what some historians call a golden age of relative tolerance and cultural flourishing. Yet even this golden period included periodic persecution and mandatory symbols of inferiority. In other times and places, violent pogroms erupted against Jewish communities in Arab lands, with blood spilled in the name of ancient grievances. The sibling rivalry encoded in Genesis has proven eerily prophetic. Two peoples intimately connected yet perpetually in conflict, unable to escape their shared ancestry, yet unwilling to embrace it. Like brothers who know each other's weaknesses all too well, Jews and Arabs have circled each other through history, alternating between periods of coexistence and brutal conflict. This biblical birthright battle planted the seeds for competing narratives about legitimacy, inheritance, and divine favor that continue to fuel conflicts today. When modern Israelis and Palestinians clash over land rights, they're not just fighting over real estate, they're reenacting an ancient drama of who truly belongs. What makes this ancestral divide so intractable is that both sides are reading from the same fundamental story but reaching opposite conclusions. Both claim Abraham as father. Both point to divine promises. Both feel entitled to the same patch of earth. And both believe history and God is on their side. The ancient texts that could have united these peoples instead provided the script for their enduring division, turning potential brothers into perpetual rivals locked in a struggle as old as their shared forefather. When prophets speak and gods make promises, who gets to decide what they really meant? For Jews and Arabs, their sacred texts have become more than spiritual guides. They're territorial declarations, divine property deeds, and weapons in an ideological war that has raged for centuries. The Torah, Bible, and Quran don't just tell different stories. They stake competing claims to the same strip of contested land, each with the authority of divine revelation behind them. These aren't merely theological disagreements. They're cosmic title disputes with real blood spilled over whose interpretation gets the final word. The Jewish claim begins with a dramatic divine real estate transaction. In Genesis 15, God appears to Abraham in a vision, declaring, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." This covenant is repeated and reinforced throughout the Torah, creating what Jews have understood as an eternal, divinely sanctioned deed to the land of Israel. When Moses leads the Israelites toward Canaan, it's not portrayed as a conquest but as claiming an inheritance, a return to land already promised to their ancestors. For Jews, this isn't just ancient history, it's the foundation of their very identity. The Torah intertwines the people, the law, and the land into an inseparable trinity. Jewish prayers for thousands of years have faced toward Jerusalem. Even when physically scattered across the globe, Jews maintain their spiritual and emotional connection to this land, ending Passover Seders with the declaration, "Next year in Jerusalem." But then came Islam, with its own powerful narrative that dramatically reframes this story. While acknowledging Jewish scripture as divine in origin, Islamic tradition holds that these texts were corrupted over time. The Quran positions itself as the final, perfect revelation that corrects previous misunderstandings, including those about the Holy Land. In Islamic tradition, Jerusalem becomes Al-Quds, the Holy, the site of Muhammad's miraculous night journey and ascension to heaven. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, stand directly atop the ruins of the Jewish temple, creating a literal theological overlay that claims primacy. This isn't coincidental positioning. It's a theological statement carved in stone. The Quran explicitly addresses the children of Israel's claim to the land, acknowledging God's gift to them but suggesting this covenant was conditional on their faithfulness, a condition Muslims believe the Jews failed to meet. Surah 5:21 recounts Moses telling his people, "O my people, enter the holy land which Allah has assigned to you." But later passages suggest this inheritance was revoked due to disobedience. Islamic tradition reinterprets Abraham's legacy, elevating Ishmael, the traditional ancestor of Arabs, from his secondary biblical status to being the true spiritual heir, even claiming it was Ishmael, not Isaac, whom Abraham nearly sacrificed to God. This directly challenges the foundation of the Jewish covenant narrative. Christianity added yet another layer to this textual battlefield. While early Christians saw themselves as fulfilling Jewish prophecy, the developing church increasingly viewed itself as the new Israel, spiritually supplanting Jews as God's chosen people. Christian theology often interpreted Jewish exile from the land as divine punishment for rejecting Jesus, suggesting the physical land promises had been replaced by spiritual ones. When these competing sacred narratives collided in real-world politics, the results were explosive. The Crusades represented Christian Europe's bloody attempt to reclaim what they viewed as rightfully Christian lands from Muslim rule, with Jews caught in the crossfire. Later, Zionism, while often secular in its early expressions, drew powerful motivation from biblical land promises to justify Jewish return to their ancestral homeland. For modern Palestinians, many of whom are Muslim, the Islamic narrative provides divine legitimacy to their own claims. They point to Quranic passages about the sanctity of Jerusalem and 14 centuries of predominantly Muslim rule as evidence that this land belongs to them by both divine and historical right. What makes these textual battles so intractable is that each side's claims come wrapped in absolute divine authority. How do you compromise when you believe God himself has granted you exclusive title? When your holy book says the land is yours eternally, yielding an inch becomes not just a political concession but a betrayal of divine will. These competing narratives create a tragic zero-sum game. If the Jewish reading of Scripture is correct, then Jewish claims to the land take precedence. If the Islamic interpretation prevails, then Muslim governance of the region is divinely sanctioned. Each side can point to chapter and verse to justify their position, with God himself seemingly taking sides in a territorial dispute. The texts themselves contain ambiguities that have been exploited for political ends. The precise boundaries of the Promised Land vary across different biblical passages. The conditions of the covenant, whether it's unconditional or dependent on faithfulness, are debated by scholars. And the status of non-Jews living within these boundaries receives different treatment throughout Scripture. Religious extremists on both sides have selectively weaponized these texts to justify violence. Jewish radicals cite biblical commands to drive out the Canaanites as justification for displacing Palestinians. Islamic militants invoke Quranic passages about defending Muslim lands to sanctify attacks on Israelis. Sacred words become sacred excuses for profane actions. More moderate voices have attempted to find common ground in these texts. They point to passages promoting peace, justice, and protection for the stranger. They emphasize Abraham as a shared father rather than a point of division. They suggest these ancient texts speak more to spiritual truths than modern political boundaries. But the fundamental tension remains: three religions, all claiming the same prophetic lineage, all venerating the same patriarchs, all centered on overlapping sacred geography. Yet each believing their tradition represents the true culmination of divine revelation. When religion defines not just what you believe but where you belong, theological differences become territorial imperatives. These competing sacred narratives have transformed what might have been a manageable real estate dispute into an existential conflict about divine truth. The texts that could have provided a foundation for coexistence have instead fueled a cycle of competing absolutisms where compromise feels like heresy. In this holy war of words, the most dangerous weapons aren't guns or bombs, they're interpretations. And as long as each side reads their scriptures as exclusive divine endorsements of their territorial claims, finding common ground will remain as elusive as agreeing on whose version of God has the final say. The story of Jews and Arabs isn't just one of perpetual hatred. It's a volatile pendulum swing between golden ages of cooperation and dark periods of slaughter, a relationship more complex and contradictory than either side often admits. This historical roller coaster reveals an uncomfortable truth. These two peoples have been capable of both extraordinary harmony and horrific brutality toward each other, sometimes within the same century. When Muhammad emerged from the Arabian desert in the 7th century, proclaiming a new revelation that would transform the region, Jews were among the first populations he encountered. The initial relationship was tentative but hopeful. Muhammad adopted numerous Jewish practices and even oriented prayer toward Jerusalem before later changing to Mecca. The Constitution of Medina, one of Islam's earliest political documents, explicitly included Jewish tribes as part of the community, with rights and responsibilities. But this tentative alliance shattered spectacularly. When Jewish tribes refused to accept Muhammad's prophetic claims, tension escalated to outright conflict. The aftermath was brutal. The Banu Qurayza tribe was virtually exterminated, with men executed and women and children enslaved, according to Islamic sources. This bloodshed established a troubling precedent for how religious disagreement could spiral into violence. Yet, remarkably, what followed wasn't perpetual persecution but something far more nuanced. As Islamic civilization expanded across North Africa and the Middle East, Jews found themselves living under a system that was discriminatory but not genocidal. The dhimmi status, a protected but subordinate position for people of the book, imposed humiliating restrictions and special taxes on Jews, yet also offered a level of religious autonomy unthinkable in contemporary Christian Europe, where Jews faced forced conversions, expulsions, and massacres. The result was a paradoxical golden age. While never equals, Jews in Islamic lands achieved remarkable prominence in medicine, philosophy, commerce, and even politics. In Islamic Spain, figures like Maimonides revolutionized Jewish thought while serving in Muslim courts. Hasdai ibn Shaprat became the de facto foreign minister to the Caliph of Córdoba. Jewish poets like Solomon ibn Gabirol and Judah Halevi wrote masterpieces in Arabic and Hebrew, participating in a shared cultural flourishing. This wasn't universal tolerance by modern standards. Jews remained second-class citizens who could be brutally reminded of their inferior status at any moment. Yet, compared to their treatment in Christian Europe, many Jews found the Islamic world relatively hospitable. The great Jewish philosopher Maimonides himself declared that Islam, unlike Christianity, was not idolatrous and represented genuine monotheism. The pendulum could swing violently, however. In 1066, a Muslim mob in Granada massacred thousands of Jews after rumors spread about a Jewish vizier's influence. The Almohad dynasty in 12th century North Africa forced Jews to convert to Islam or face death. These episodes of violence punctuated what was overall a complex coexistence, neither utopian nor uniformly oppressive. When European powers colonized Muslim lands in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this delicate balance fractured. Colonial authorities often favored religious minorities, creating resentment among Muslim majorities. Jews in some regions became associated with European influence, a deadly alignment as anti-colonial nationalism surged across the Arab world. The establishment of Israel in 1948 triggered the most dramatic rupture. Virtually overnight, ancient Jewish communities across the Arab world, some dating back 2 millennia, collapsed. From Morocco to Iraq, approximately 850,000 Jews fled or were expelled from Arab countries, their property confiscated and centuries of history erased. Cities like Baghdad, which was once one-third Jewish, saw their Jewish populations reduced to virtually zero. This mass exodus, a Nakba or catastrophe rarely acknowledged in Western discourse, mirrored the Palestinian displacement that occurred simultaneously. Two peoples, both indigenous to the region, both experiencing exile and dispossession, each focused on their own suffering while minimizing the others. The tragedy of this history is how selectively it's remembered. Arab narratives often romanticize Islamic Spain while downplaying the dhimmi system's inherent inequality. Jewish accounts sometimes focus exclusively on persecution while overlooking periods of genuine cultural symbiosis. Both sides cherry-pick historical episodes that validate their current political positions. The most provocative truth is that Jews often thrived more under Muslim rule than Christian governance for much of history, a reality that complicates simplistic narratives about inherent Muslim anti-Semitism. Yet equally true is that this relative tolerance was conditional, contingent on Jewish acceptance of permanent inferiority within the Islamic social order. What's lost in today's polarized rhetoric is recognition of the genuine cultural exchange that occurred despite unequal power dynamics. Jewish philosophers engaged deeply with Islamic thought. Arabic became a primary language for Jewish intellectual production. Medical knowledge flowed between communities. The great works of Greek philosophy were preserved through collaborative efforts of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars. The current Israeli-Palestinian conflict doesn't represent some inevitable clash hardwired into these communities from birth. Rather, it's the bitter fruit of modern nationalism colliding with colonial aftermath, religious extremism, and great power politics, all filtered through selective readings of a complex shared history. Perhaps the most dangerous myth is that Jews and Arabs have always been enemies. This falsification of history serves extremists on both sides who prefer a simple narrative of eternal conflict over the messier reality of a relationship that has encompassed both persecution and partnership, violence and coexistence. The historical record shows neither pure harmony nor pure hatred, but rather two peoples bound together by geography, monotheism, and cultural exchange, sometimes as oppressor and oppressed, sometimes as collaborators, often as uneasy neighbors negotiating difference in shared spaces. What makes today's conflict so tragic is that both Jews and Arabs can legitimately point to historical periods when they suffered at each other's hands, creating competing victimhood narratives that fuel current grievances. Both can also reference times when cooperation produced remarkable cultural achievements, proof that coexistence isn't merely theoretical but has historical precedent. This blood-soaked dance through time reveals an uncomfortable truth. The relationship between these peoples has never been static but constantly evolving, influenced by broader political currents, religious developments, and power dynamics. Understanding this complex history doesn't provide easy solutions to current conflicts, but it does demolish simplistic narratives that portray today's tensions as the inevitable expression of ancient hatreds. The real tragedy isn't that Jews and Arabs have always been enemies. It's that they've proven capable of both extraordinary cooperation and horrific violence toward each other, making their current impasse all the more heartbreaking when viewed against the backdrop of what might have been.